It is April 5th, 1945, and rain drums relentlessly against the windows of the Combined Fleet headquarters in Hiyoshi, as Admiral Soemu Toyoda's staff officers gather around the operations table to receive their final orders. Before them lies a dispatch from the Imperial General Headquarters, containing characters that you would immediately recognize as a death sentence. Operation Tengo, a directive for the Surface Special Attack Force to sortie for Okinawa. The mission requires the battleship Yamato to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until she is inevitably destroyed. As Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka sets down his teacup and reaches for the secure telephone, the staggering disparity of forces becomes clear. 1 battleship, 1 light cruiser, and 8 destroyers are about to face the entire American Fifth Fleet. While they prepare to engage giants like the USS Bunker Hill, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Essex, none of them fully grasp that this single desperate mission will trigger the most devastating carrier airstrike against a surface warship in naval history. You know that the Pacific War has already taught Japanese commanders that battleships are no longer queens of the ocean, but targets. Sinking them will cause the Imperial Navy's last pretensive power to vanish completely. By this stage of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Second Fleet has been reduced to a mere shadow of its former strength, leaving only 1 operational battleship, the Yamato. You will recall that her sister ship, the Musashi, was sunk 6 months earlier in the Sibuyan Sea, or the Shinano, converted to an aircraft carrier, lasted only 10 days after commissioning before American submarines sent her to the bottom. On the opposing side, the USS Bunker Hill slices through Pacific swells at 25 knots, her Essex-class hull displacing 27,100 tons of seawater, as Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher studies intelligence reports on the flag bridge. His command, Task Force 58, controls a staggering 386 aircraft spread across 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, leading a force specifically designed to project American air power across vast ocean distances. This armada relies on F-6F Hellcats for fighter cover and SB-2C Helldivers for dive bombing, but the weapon you will see make history is the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, mounted in the bomb bays of TBF Avengers. The Mark 13 represents American engineering refined through 3 years of combat experience. Unlike the erratic early war models, this improved weapon carries 600 pounds of Torpex explosive and can be dropped at 260 knots from an altitude of 800 feet. American pilots have learned to concentrate their attacks on one side of enemy ships to induce catastrophic listing that prevents effective counterflooding, a strategy crucial for this encounter. Commander James D. Ramage, the air group commander aboard the Enterprise, has studied Japanese ship construction until he can sketch the Yamato's armor scheme from memory. Born in Waterloo, Iowa, with a degree in aeronautical engineering, Ramage understands that sinking the Yamato requires precise coordination, necessitating multiple torpedo hits below the armor belt and bomb strikes to knock out anti-aircraft positions. Aboard the Japanese battleship Yamato, Captain Kosaku Aruga reviews the mission orders for the 10th time, knowing that on April 6th, the ship will take on 3,400 tons of fuel oil at the Tokuyama depot. In a secret defiance of orders to provide only enough fuel for a one-way mission, the depot personnel give the task force 60% of their capacity, rather than the authorized 40%. While theoretically enough for a round trip at economical speed, you know that the demands of combat maneuvering will consume this fuel long before any return is possible. Aruga commanded destroyers at Midway and saw the carriers Akagi and Kaga consumed by American dive bombers, so he knows exactly what carrier aircraft can do to ships without air protection. The Yamato displaces 72,809 tons fully loaded, powered by 12 Campon boilers driving 4 steam turbines, and her crew of 3,332 men has survived air attacks at Leyte Gulf and submarine encounters in the Philippine Sea. However, the battleship's greatest vulnerability remains unchanged since Pearl Harbor. She is susceptible to concentrated air attacks arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. The American carriers form 3 task groups as they steam toward the intercept position. Task Group 58.1 to the north, 58.3 to the east, and 58.4 racing to join from refueling operations, launching search aircraft in expanding box patterns. You can picture the radar operators working grueling 4-hour shifts, their screens glowing with force returns from wave tops and rain squalls, while Aircraft Coordinator Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taylor manages the complex aerial ballet with launch cycles every 90 minutes. On April 6, 1945, at 15:20 hours, the Yamato Task Force departs Tokuyama Harbor with 10 ships, led by the light cruiser Yahagi and followed by destroyers, with the Yamato bringing up the rear. This mission is the Navy's answer to the Emperor's question regarding their assistance in defending Okinawa, a gesture of loyalty that everyone knows is futile. As the task force sorties through the Bungo Strait, the USS Threadfin, commanded by Commander John Joseph Foote, picks up the contacts on radar at approximately 17:45, surfacing to transmit a report that prioritizes speed over security. As the Japanese naval force entered the East China Sea, the USS Hackleback, positioned further to the south, assumed the critical burden of surveillance. Commander Frederick Edward Janney doggedly tracked the flotilla throughout the night, successfully transmitting 4 detailed position reports despite the aggressive screening maneuvers of Japanese destroyers. By the time dawn broke on April 7th, the weather had deteriorated significantly, with low cloud ceilings hovering at 1,500 feet and rain squalls reducing visibility to a mere 5 miles. At 0600 hours, 6 fighters arrived from Kyushu to provide the promised air cover, yet they were scheduled to depart by 10 a.m., offering exactly 4 hours of minimal protection. These aircraft orbited high above the cloud layer at 15,000 feet, rendering them essentially useless against low-level torpedo attacks. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, had issued orders for his battleships to prepare for surface action, intending to pit 6 radar-equipped modern battleships against the solitary, fuel-starved Japanese giant. However, Vice Admiral Mitcher had a different tactical vision. At 0800, without awaiting Spruance's authorization, he ordered his carriers to unleash their strike groups. Earlier that morning, at 0657, the destroyer Asashimo had signaled a critical engine failure. Captain Hisao Kotaki, commanding Destroyer Division 21 from aboard the vessel, ordered emergency repairs, but the mechanical damage proved far beyond the crew's ability to rectify at sea, forcing the ship to fall steadily astern as the task force pressed on toward Okinawa. By 10 a.m., task groups 58.1 and 58.3 began launching a massive strike package: 132 fighters, 50 dive bombers, and 98 torpedo planes. This aerial armada, drawn from 11 carriers, began converging on a single target. The American tactical plan was ruthless in its precision. Fighters were tasked with going in first to suppress anti-aircraft batteries. Dive bombers would attack from multiple vectors to fragment defensive fire, and torpedo bombers would coordinate their runs to ensure impacts on the same side of the target. Throughout the approach, PBM Mariner flying boats maintained contact, circling just outside gun range while radioing continuous position updates. At 12:20, lookouts aboard the Yamato sighted the first wave of American aircraft, dark specks emerging from the clouds, rapidly growing larger and multiplying, prompting the anti-aircraft guns to elevate in anticipation of the order to fire. At 12:32, the Yamato opened fire with her main battery, discharging 9 18.1-inch guns loaded with Son-Shiki anti-aircraft shells. These massive 3,200-pound projectiles were designed to explode in the air, scattering thousands of incendiary fragments. Yet they detonated at preset distances, which skilled pilots easily evaded by simply altering their altitude. Furthermore, these massive guns could only fire once per minute in an anti-aircraft roll, a rate that proved woefully inadequate against American aircraft that were commencing attack runs every few seconds. The first coordinated assault struck at 12:35 as air groups from the USS Bennington and USS Hornet split into multiple attack elements. Through the driving rain and spray, the Yamato appeared impossibly colossal, her 863-foot length and pagoda superstructure towering 150 feet above the water, now shrouded in a lethal web of steel and fire from erupting gun mounts. At 12:37, the first torpedo slammed into the Yamato's port side near the aft secondary battery, sending a column of water 100 feet into the air. 2 minutes later, a second torpedo struck her port amidships, while a 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the deck near the aft 6.1-inch turret, igniting infernos that would burn until the ship was lost. While damage control parties raced to flood starboard compartments to correct the developing list, the isolated destroyer Asashimo, still struggling with engine problems, was caught at 12:30 by aircraft from the USS San Jacinto. Unable to maneuver effectively, she absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits and sank with all hands, claiming 326 crew members, including Captain Kataki. No survivors were recovered. Shortly after, at 12:43, the destroyer Hamikaze took a direct bomb hit to her bridge that killed her captain and most of the command crew. Burning and out of control, she was finished off by torpedo bombers, taking 242 men down with her. Simultaneously, the light cruiser Yahagi was pummeled by aircraft from 3 different carriers, leaving her dead in the water and burning furiously. By 1300 hours, the Yamato had sustained at least 5 torpedo hits, all concentrated on the port side, causing her list to increase to 15 degrees despite counterflooding efforts, while her speed dropped to 18 knots. Even as she struggled, the second wave was already forming up. 100 fresh aircraft from task groups 58.1 and 58.3, fully armed and pitted against a wounded giant that could no longer maneuver effectively. The torpedo bombers executed their attacks with practiced precision, approaching from 3 distinct bearings to ensure maximum devastation to the port hull. At 13:42, 3 additional torpedoes struck the port side, pushing the Yamato's list to 20 degrees as seawater flooded through damaged hatches, entering spaces that should have remained watertight. When the assistant damage control officer reported to Captain Aruga that counterflooding was no longer possible because all starboard void spaces were already flooded, Vice Admiral Ito recognized the inevitable. At 13:50, he ordered the cancellation of Operation Tengo, hoisting signal flags to command the surviving destroyers to rescue the crew, as the battleship's radio rooms had been obliterated and communication was possible only through visual signals amidst the smoke and spray. At 14:02, Captain Aruga gave the order to abandon ship, but the list was already approaching 30 degrees, making movement on the tilting deck nearly impossible. Men slid helplessly into the water, while others were trapped below as hatches jammed or passages flooded. The Emperor's portrait was retrieved from the bridge and entrusted to a junior officer with orders to survive. Executive Officer Captain Jiro Nomura tried to convince Aruga to leave the bridge, but the captain refused, ordering Nomura to save himself while he lashed himself to the compass binnacle, determined to go down with his ship. Vice Admiral Ito similarly retired to his cabin, refusing all entreaties to abandon ship. At 14:07, a final torpedo struck the starboard side, the only hit on that flank during the entire battle. The initial impact of the torpedoes registered as barely more than a tremor, for the Yamato had already listed past 35 degrees, forcing desperate men to leap from the rising starboard side and plummet 60 feet or more into the churning ocean. The battleship's structural integrity began to fail, as the colossal 18.1-inch gun turrets, each weighing an immense 2,774 tons, tore free from their mountings. By 1414, the list had reached a critical 90 degrees. The ship lay completely on her side, her massive hull still slicing through the water, while inside, hundreds of sailors remained trapped in compartments that had transformed into inescapable tombs. At 1417, the forward magazines ignited in a cataclysmic detonation that was visible 160 kilometers away in Cayeux. A mushroom cloud erupted 20,000 feet into the overcast sky, punching through the clouds and generating a blast wave so powerful it knocked nearby American aircraft out of control and inflicted damage on those flying too close. When the smoke finally cleared, the Yamato had vanished, leaving only scattered debris and a slick of oil to mark the grave where the world's largest battleship had existed only moments before. Of the Yamato's massive crew of 3,332 men, only 276 survived the devastation. Vice Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and the majority of the senior officers chose to go down with their ship. Nearby, the destroyer Yukazi and Fuyutsuki managed to rescue survivors despite the relentless air attacks, their crews throwing every buoyant object overboard to aid the men struggling in the water. The destroyer Kasumi, having lost her bow and suffered heavy damage, was scuttled by torpedoes from Fujitsuki, while the Isukazi, burning and dead in the water, met a similar fate. The light cruiser Yahagi finally sank at 1405, having put up a spirited but doomed resistance against overwhelming odds. The final tally of the engagement was devastating. 6 of the 10 Japanese ships were sunk, resulting in the deaths of approximately 4,137 sailors. In stark contrast, American losses amounted to merely 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew members. Carrier aviation had achieved in just 2 hours what would have taken traditional battleships a day-long engagement to accomplish, assuming they could have achieved it at all. The success of Task Force 58 represented the true maturation of carrier warfare doctrine, demonstrating the lethal efficiency of coordinating strikes from multiple carriers to overwhelm defenses. The tactical precision of targeting one side of the ship to induce capsizing showcased American naval aviation at its absolute zenith. 3.5 years after Pearl Harbor, the long-standing prophecy of air power advocates had been fulfilled in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. You can see that the psychological impact on the Imperial Navy was absolutely shattering. For the Yamato was far more than just a warship. She was a symbol of the nation itself. The name Yamato was the ancient poetic designation for Japan, and her loss represented not merely a military defeat, but a complete spiritual collapse. Admiral Toyota would later write that the failure of Operation Tengo marked the effective end of the Imperial Navy as a fighting force. Throughout the conflict, intelligence capabilities provided a crucial advantage that cannot be overstated. American codebreakers had been intercepting and reading Japanese naval communications, often knowing about a sortie before the Japanese ship captains had even received their orders. Submarines were pre-positioned, and search patterns were optimized, ensuring that the element of surprise was completely absent for the Japanese forces. The training standards of the era reflected the vast industrial gap between the two nations. American pilots arriving in the Pacific in 1945 averaged 300 hours of flight training, compared to a mere 100 hours for their Japanese counterparts. Furthermore, American squadrons rotated home after combat tours to train replacements, whereas Japanese squadrons remained in combat until they were effectively destroyed. The battle profoundly influenced post-war naval construction worldwide, as every major navy studied the engagement and recognized that the era of the battleship was over. It became clear that anti-aircraft defenses needed fundamental improvement and that radar and communications had become just as vital as guns and armor. Admiral Mitch's after-action report emphasized that coordination was the key to success, noting that 11 carriers launching strikes required precise timing to prevent mutual interference, lessons that would be applied in Korea 5 years later. Individual stories serve to illuminate the scale of the tragedy, such as that of Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the Yamato's few surviving bridge officers, who would later write of watching American pilots press their attacks through murderous anti-aircraft fire. He noted that their courage equaled that of any samurai. Similarly, Captain Tamichihara of the destroyer Yahagi survived her sinking and would later write eloquently about the sheer futility of the battle. The strategic implications of this defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The failure of Operation Tengo meant that the defenders of Okinawa would receive no naval support. American casualties at Okinawa, which exceeded 50,000, might have been significantly higher had the Yamato succeeded in reaching the invasion beaches and turning her massive guns on the landing forces. Planning for the eventual invasion of Japan was heavily influenced by the Yamato's destruction. Military planners reasoned that if the Japanese were willing to sacrifice their last battleship in a suicide mission, their defense of the home islands would be fanatical. The decision to use the atomic bomb 4 months later was partially justified by this perceived willingness of Japan to accept unlimited casualties rather than surrender. The wreck of the Yamato was eventually discovered in 1985, broken into 2 main sections and resting in 340 meters of water. The bow section landed upright, with the Imperial chrysanthemum crest still visible, while the stern section was devastated by the massive magazine explosion. Modern analysis suggests the ship absorbed between 11 and 13 torpedo hits and 6 to 8 bomb hits, but the critical damage was the progressive flooding caused by the concentration of torpedo strikes on the port side. In the years since, veterans' reunions have brought together former enemies to reflect on the battle. In 1985, survivors from the Yamato met with the American pilots who had attacked her, with the Japanese acknowledging the mission was futile from its inception, and the Americans expressing deep respect for the courage of men who sailed, knowing they would not return. The memorial at Kure, Japan, where the Yamato was built, now draws thousands of visitors annually. Today, Japanese visitors come to honor the ultimate sacrifice of the crew, while Americans visit to understand their former enemy. The museum emphasizes peace through the act of remembering war's terrible price, and cultural depictions, such as the 2005 film Yamato, portray the crew's sacrifice as heroic, yet tragic. Both perspectives contain truth. The battle was simultaneously a human tragedy for the men who died and a definitive demonstration of military evolution, leaving an environmental and historical impact that continues today. Deep within the ocean, the wreckage of the Yamato still holds an estimated 1,000 tons of fuel oil, a toxic legacy that continues to leak slowly into the surrounding waters. This submerged battlefield is officially recognized as a war grave, a designation that safeguards it from salvage operations through binding international agreements. In military academies around the globe, this engagement serves as a critical case study, illustrating the absolute necessity of air superiority and the perils of adhering to outdated combat doctrines. Operation Tengo is frequently analyzed to demonstrate how institutional pride can disastrously obscure sound tactical judgment, emphasizing the terrible human cost that arises when a force refuses to accept the reality of defeat. Technical reconstruction of the battle highlights the immense sophistication of the American offensive, which was far from a chaotic melee. It was a meticulously orchestrated operation. Torpedo bombers executed their runs at precise angles to ensure the highest probability of impact, while dive bombers specifically crippled communication and fire control networks as fighter aircraft systematically suppressed anti-aircraft batteries. The environmental conditions played a decisive role in the unfolding chaos, as low cloud cover negated the option of high-altitude bombing and forced aircraft to descend directly into defensive fire. While rain squalls offered intermittent concealment for approaching torpedo bombers, the rough seas significantly hampered the crew's desperate attempts at damage control. These physical challenges were compounded by a catastrophic breakdown in command and control, which accelerated the collapse of organized resistance. With the Yamato's radio antennas severed early in the engagement and visual flag signals obscured by thick smoke, the inability to coordinate effectively left the fleet vulnerable and isolated. The outcome was also sculpted by the distinct leadership philosophies of the opposing commanders, whose actions mirrored their respective service cultures. Admiral Mitcher acted with aggression, launching strikes without waiting for explicit authorization, while Vice Admiral Ito adhered to his orders despite harboring deep personal reservations, and Captain Aruga executed his duty without question. Today, the Yamato lies fragmented in the depths of the East China Sea, her massive guns silenced and her crew entombed within the crushed hull. Although the battle has long since passed, it leaves behind enduring lessons. Pride can lead to ruin, and even the greatest courage cannot overcome a severe material disadvantage where technology dictates capability. The sinking of this colossus marked more than just the end of the battleship era. It signaled a dawning realization regarding the true nature of modern warfare. While Operation Tengo failed tactically, it succeeded in grimly demonstrating the futility of clinging to obsolete concepts. This warning, inscribed in the lives of 4,137 Japanese sailors and 12 Americans, remains the Yamato's final service to humanity, echoing across the decades to reach us today.